What's up, everybody? Good morning to you. Welcome to day 3 of Indie Design Week.
Day 3.
It's been great. It's been a really great event so far. Thanks for having us again, and thanks to SEP and Salesforce for making this happen. So I hope you're ready for day 3. It's the last day, so let's bring the energy, let's bring the focus, and finish strong. So I know Chris and Mahid and everybody, they've been kind of talking over the days about YouTube and how to get started. So I'm kind of here with just some general advice that you could also apply to other facets of your life. But really the key to success on YouTube is consistency. Obviously, staying motivated, staying focused, but consistency is the only thing. There's an audience for anything and everything out there. There's a topic for anything and everything out there. And all you really have to do is just consistently upload and your audience will build. We didn't know we needed cat videos in our lives until somebody started putting them up, and now it's like amazing. But in relation to you guys in design work, I'm sure a lot of you have something to say. Some of the biggest successful topics on YouTube is commentary channels or podcasts. And I think those are also relatively easy to get started. You just need your phone and just talk to it. All of you, I'm sure, have, even our keynote speakers, like they can do it podcast style. Everybody has input to give. And I think that would be a great way to get started for sure.
So does the production quality matter?
It does. I mean, over time, but I would say it's less so because it's definitely your content that matters more. Like for us, we do a lot of skits, and so we try to put a lot of production value into it. Meanwhile, you see another creator just in their room with a cell phone and they have millions of views. So production value definitely matters, but not so much as the quality of your content. I think people are willing to forgive the production value if what you have to say is good content. So that would definitely be my advice. And staying consistent is a hard thing to do. I think one of my favorite self-help books, I would recommend it to everybody, is Atomic Habits by James Clear. That's one of my favorite books because it touches on the fact of don't be focused on the end goal, be focused on the trajectory to the end goal. And as long as you stay on the right trajectory, the end goal is inevitable. It's like going to the gym. Everybody's end goal is I want to look good, I want to be fit, but the trajectory is going to the gym every single day. And if you focus on going to the gym every single day as opposed to focusing on wanting to look good, looking good is an inevitable outcome of going to the gym every day. So I think that's important because we always look at other people's success like, oh, what was that one big defining moment that launched them into success? And that's not how it works. It's really small, consistent victories on a daily basis that get you there. So
that reminds me of Noel's talk from last year on showing up.
Mm-hmm.
You need to show up.
Exactly.
And then now that you're showing up, how are you showing up?
Exactly.
Right? What are you bringing to the situation when you're there?
For sure. And it's hard to stay motivated every single day. And I think we have a speaker today that's going to be talking about burnout, which is a very big thing in our industry, especially with the digital age. We're all in front of our computers all the time and burnout. I actually just came back from some PTO myself because I was just I need a break. So you got to take breaks too, but yeah, it's like you said, you got to show up every day with a game plan and just put yourself out there. No one's going to notice you unless you put yourself out there.
So what kind of recommendations would you have for growing your audience outside of consistency? So I'm consistently putting content out there. Indie Design Week, we're consistent. We've been doing it every year, regardless of the pandemic, my pregnancy, we're making it happen.
For sure.
But how would you recommend growing your audience? Because you took it from, you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I think it takes a little bit of time to find your audience. And I would definitely say utilizing other social medias. We started with YouTube, and then we realized, hey, we could also transfer this content to Instagram. We could also take this content to Facebook. So broaden your horizons into where you can put your content. I think definitely you can maximize your audience by putting yourself out there in a lot of different places, because you might start on one platform and it may not be working for you, and then you jump to another platform and all of a sudden that same exact content for some reason is getting better audience on a different platform. So I think just kind of, putting your content out there as much as possible. Utilize your friends, man. I mean, in the beginning, everybody needs help in the beginning. I mean, you're not going to go viral right off the bat. So in the beginning, it was just like our friends checking out our videos and be like, oh, that's pretty sweet. And obviously there was a little bit of luck involved too. Like, we did get viral on 4chan as a website, but there's a little bit of luck involved too. But I think that luck is also kind of a byproduct of, like you said, showing up. Like, you're more likely to get lucky the more you show up and the more you are prepared for what you want to put out there.
Like buy more lottery tickets and you're likely to win?
Well,
no.
I don't know.
I'm not an advocate for that.
I don't know about that, but yeah, and it's tough to make it on the internet too, because we live in such a instant gratification culture, and everything is just now. Amazon Prime, you get what you ordered today, so it's kind of conditioned us to think about success in an instantaneous way too. Like, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we just get success? If we could decide what we wanted to do and then just be successful at it. But it's really that daily grind that gets you there. So you can't. There's no quick path there. You're just gonna have to grind it out for a little bit and get help from where you can. And showing up to events like these, like find yourself in a community with like-minded people, because I think collaboration is so important. Like it's so hard to try to make it on your own. Like for us, we're a group of friends that kind of bounce ideas off of each other. But a lot of YouTubers have solo channels, but even they are going to events and conventions and connecting with people. And I think events like these are so important because of that reason. Because you can network with it. You're one networking opportunity away from like a big change. So I think collaboration is a really big key also.
Have you guys branched into TikTok at all?
We have. So Rana is our social media coordinator. We're getting close to 10K on TikTok. TikTok is a weird one because a lot of us are older. So I feel so weird being on TikTok.
Yeah.
But it's important. Like I'm a little jaded about social media. I'm not a big social media person, but my job requires it. But if you're an older person, you cannot neglect the value of these social medias. You can't, you gotta at least, if you don't want to be involved in it, at least learn about it, know how it works, who's watching it, for what purpose, what are people getting out of it. And that's another thing, is every platform has its own kind of established style, right? So you need to keep up. The world is going to evolve with or without you. So you gotta, if you don't want to be involved in it, you gotta at least know how it works.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some insight into what it takes to run a YouTube channel. Coming up next, your opening keynote for today
is, so she is a urban planner and a researcher, currently pursuing her Ph.D., and her research is based on the context of race and space. So here to talk to us about dignity and design, please help me welcome Danicia Monét.
Yes.
So, hi everyone. I am just delighted to be here with you and very appreciative of the invitation to share with you today. Before we begin, I would like to take a minute to recall ourselves and our collective breath. And that means that if we are all elements of one body, as I believe that we are, then how do we unite? One way to do this is through the veneration of the breath, because if you can honor your own, then that means you can honor mine and we can value one another's lives. So if you would join me in a collective breath, and just start by feeling the earth beneath you, relaxing your mind and your body, and taking a deep breath in through your nose. Hold that in your chest, and then slowly release that through your mouth. So as a practitioner, I'm an interdisciplinary practitioner at the intersections of urban planning, contemplation, research, design, and art. And I'm most interested in the built environment, both physical and ephemeral. I'm interested in how we build worlds and the way those spaces and places affect us. Now, if this was a call and response situation, I'd be really curious to know how many of you could name just 5 Black designers, Black architects, or Black urban planners. And that thought has been with me today and throughout this week. And so at the last minute, I kind of decided to switch up what I was going to share, because the events of this week and the weight of everything that's been going on. And so 2 days ago, I hosted a student appreciation day at the Purdue Black Cultural Center. This is where I work, and we've been on a hybrid model as a university, and COVID has been incredibly hard on students as a whole. But in particular, I was thinking about our Black students. So you compound this idea of practicing physical distancing and sometimes social distancing, and I do think the two are different things, on top of being a Black student who's attending a predominantly white institution. And I imagine that to be abundantly isolating. And so we held the student appreciation event, and students were coming into the center just to be loved on and be appreciated and be in fellowship. And because we're in a hybrid model, our hours have changed over the last year. Instead of us being from 8 to 10, we're now on a 10 to 4 schedule. And so many of them were sharing how much they missed just being in the center and what this space meant to them. So many of them said that it was a home away from home. It was a place that they felt seen and heard and validated and encouraged. It was a place where they felt free to be themselves and to meet people without pretense. And I was having kind of a, I'm not crying, you're crying sort of moment, but it ultimately made me reflect, how could a space be so significant? Without question, the Purdue Black Cultural Center is a gym. It's by far one of my favorite spaces in the entire state of Indiana. And I think it is so because it's both a cultural and a spiritual totem of sorts. The space was designed by Black burn architects, and the entire structure was designed with the idea of dignity in mind. The archway that you see here is mirrored on both entrances to the building, north and south, and they're very significant because they harken back to the keyhole design that you find in African schemes, used both in the keyhole African garden, and that's its actual name, that fashions the compost directly into the bed so that nutrients can seep into the soil. It's also a prominent feature in some African village entryways, or in particular doorways to where the chief might reside. So when you walk through our keyhole, when you walk through this portal, it bears 2 meanings to all visitors. One, that you are welcome, and 2, that you are safe. And to me, that's a very powerful notion today, especially when we see so many Black bodies being targeted. Once you're through the keyhole and inside the building, you're embraced by the African Adinkra symbol, Mafandran, which means fortitude. All of these elements are literally seeping into your being somatically, much like the nutrients from the African keyhole garden I mentioned. This right here is dignity in design. It's been said that dignity is to design what justice is to law and what wellness is to medicine, because ultimately it's about having your value reflected in the spaces and places that you inhabit. Now for me, besides being tall, as a woman, as a Black woman, I walk through the world here in the United States and I don't see myself. If you think of buildings as personalities, few, if any of them, reflect my cultural sensibility, my personality, my being. And it's said that architecture spiritualizes fact. It has a way of concretizing that what you think. And most of us spend the majority of our lives in spaces that we didn't design or build. And so when space begins to acknowledge you and celebrate you, you believe that you're valued. It also tells others that you are to be valued. Many of us right now are sighing relief at the verdict given regarding the death of George Floyd, that too happened just 2 days ago. And this week has, as I mentioned, just made me reflect. And it made me think about another George. It was George Heigl, who's a philosopher that influenced the forefathers' design of the Americas, who wrote in his book, The Philosophy of History, that the Negro lacks subjectivity, consciousness, and has nothing to provide to civilization. So if this is the ideology of the people who fashioned our world, it's no surprise then that the world proclaims that Blackness is to be exploited, but Black people are not to be protected, not to be reflected or protected in the public imaginary of space. We're made invisible. And this invisibility is a steadfast practice that has rendered Blackness as a commodity for capital and nothing more. This is a colonial project. Now, we as a society, we recognize and we revere cultural spaces such as Chinatown and Greektown, Germantown, Little Tokyo and Little Havana, but we pause at celebrating Black spaces. In fact, often the practice has been the systemic erasure of Black spaces. In America, there is approximately 50 million people who live in a distressed community, characterized by poverty, unemployment, low levels of education. So it's shocking to me that 70% of the nation's 1,036 majority Black zip codes are also considered distressed. And while there are many systemic causes to the distress experienced in these predominantly Black communities, one in particular can be traced back to the coordinated attacks on Black communities. In 1855, New York's Seneca Village was a largely Black settlement with around 225 people. The Upper Manhattan community included an economic mix of people who lived in everything from shanties to two-story homes. And of the 100 Black eligible voters in the entire state of New York, 10 of them were from Seneca Village. But just a couple of years later, the community was gone. Its land had been acquired through eminent domain to create Central Park. In 1929, 9,000 out of a total 11,000 Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma residents were left homeless after a mob descended, killing 300 and burning the town. More contemporary is the 1985 bombing in West Philly community that housed the Black liberation group MOVE. Police fired tear gas, water cannons, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They followed this by dropping a satchel bomb, the kind that you would see in World War II and in Vietnam. And after the bombing, a fire broke out, as was known to do after these bombs were to be released, and it claimed 61 surrounding buildings and left 250 people homeless and 3 dead from this middle-class Black neighborhood. It's also been alleged that the killing of Breonna Taylor was due to a community gentrification plan. Not to mention that Black people make up 12% of the US population, but we make up 34% of the US prison industrial complex. So in many ways, Black people are effectively being removed from place. Why is this? I think it's because we don't live in places that honor our identities. We don't live in places that have a cultural consciousness to their design. Why is this image synonymous with Black, but this one is not? Negative impressions of Black neighborhoods inform the way we see ourselves and the way that others do too. Recent research by Courtney Bonham found that white people believe that the presence of a Black family means that the neighborhood is impoverished, crime-ridden, and dirty. What got us to this present was a historical revisionist practice where Black communities were destroyed. So what does it mean to exist in place that doesn't center your cultural identity, that doesn't see you? The design fields are majority white. There are 2% Black architects and 7% Black urban planners and designers. And many designers will say, well, you know, there's not a Black aesthetic, there's not a singular Black identity. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's not a singular Black identity. Blackness is not a monolith, but it's not about reducing to a common denominator, but rather about finding shared experience, about inspiration in the elsewhere. It was Pablo Picasso and Swiss architect Le Corbusier who were so in love with Black culture that they considered themselves Negrophiliacs. And it was Le Corbusier who said that Negro music has touched America because it's the melody of the soul joined with the rhythm of the machine. It's two-part time. It's tears in the heart, it's movement in the legs, it's torso, arms, and head. It's the music of the era of construction. It's innovating. He continued to say it floods the body and the heart, it floods the US and it floods the world. Jazz is more advanced than the architecture. He continues to say that if architecture were at the point reached by jazz, it would be an incredible spectacle. Le Corbusier went on to coin the term Art Deco, which we know widely here in the Americas. And this was influenced by African fractal design and the Harlem Renaissance. Now, African fractal design is an ancient ritualistic practice, and fractals can be seen in STEM fields all over, but they're also common in African knowledge systems. And it's been a long-standing fact in that patterns can be attributed to different cultures. In Europe and in America, we see cities in a grid pattern with right angles. And in China, we see the use of the hexagon. And these design themes are threads that run through the social fabric. The fractal was thought to be discovered by a mathematician named George Cantor in search of infinity. And not only did he uncover infinity with the fractal, but he also found that it's recursive. So small subsets are reflections of the whole. So there may be an attempt to erase our identity, but we are the masters of the remix, and we are the sum of a greater whole. So what does this look like in modern day? Well, here we see an example of how hair braiding patterns are being used as facade design, as imagined by a young Black architect, DeMar Matthews. This is happening in Watts, California. Or here we see Brian Stevenson and Mass Design Group centering cultural memory to design the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, whereby soil is collected from lynching sites and structures are suspended that represent the counties in the United States where racial terror, lynchings took place, each engraved with the names of the victims. And duplicates you'll find of each monument lie in the memory bank outside of the primary structure. And the idea is that counties will claim and bring it back to have a truth and reconciliation process in their community. Here we see another bi-mass design group in the facade of the Cleveland Library. It's the MLK Junior branch, and it's referencing the crossroads quilting pattern that you would find in enslaved African quilting patterns. Another here is by Marco Thorpe, who's referencing indigeneity with his housing, specifically for weavers, welders, and furniture manufacturers. Once again, dignity in design. And one more is the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History, designed by David Adjaye. And this design rests on 3 cornerstones: the corona, which is the form of the building, the extension of the building into the landscape as the porch, and the bronze filigree as the envelope. So designing for dignity must become a matter of practice, not just policy, and not something abstract. As organizations and governments seek to become anti-racist, we as designers can guide efforts towards solutions for centering a cultural aesthetic. We literally design spaces and places that inform collective thought. So in tandem with unlearning bias, we as designers must help to deconstruct inequity. Now, I grew up in various diasporic communities around the world. I grew up in the South, I grew up in the Caribbean, with Islanders, Filipinos, Burmese, and indigenous people. And from all of these backdrops, I've absorbed so many different ways of cultural expression. And yet it's only in the United States that the idea of a Black cultural vernacular in the built environment seems non-existent. Good design should not be relegated just to the privileged. There is something to be said about the cultural identity of a place and how it informs and affects the quality of life of its residents. It was activist Whitney Young, who's a former director of the National Urban League, who was quoted as saying that the design field is thunderously silent and completely irrelevant. I don't think that he was wrong, but I think now is the time that we have the chance to change that. Here we see examples of Black expression from South Africa to the United States. Incorporating a Black design aesthetic should go hand in hand with the evolution of the design field. Allowing members of a community to be attuned to the spirituality, to the language, to the landscape of the places they inhabit. The process of design can partner with the artistic because it's an orchestration of public engagement that gives voice and clarity in the built form. And over time, this practice begins to empower communities to design and plan for themselves culturally relevant and good buildings. So instead of destroying, modernism's challenge is the interplay between form, function, and freedom. This is dignity in design. Now, at the start of this talk, you might not have been able to name any Black designers, planners, or architects, but hopefully now you can. I asked earlier, what does it mean to live in a place that doesn't see you? But the more important question is, what does it mean to exist in a place that does? This is summarized best through a beautiful South African saying, Sawubona. It simply translates to, I see you. I see you. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay,
About
sorry about that. We were muted.
Just to reiterate, we were saying that was a just an amazingly powerful presentation and talk, and really moving for me at least.
For sure, I've that was really refreshing. I've never thought about design and space in that way, but I think that was a very, very important message, and that was a very different perspective on design.
A lot of the things that you were telling us about with the energy and like what a block space is reminded me a little bit of just kind of a comment that was used by one of our previous keynotes, Mike Keene, who just, and it stuck with me. I wrote it down actually in our Q&A chat that we have going on, and it's the embodied energy, spaces embody energy, and everything that you were talking about just put me right back into that space. So it's more of a comment that I have for now, that it's so important to elevate and celebrate these Black spaces, and I really appreciate this talk that you've put together for us here today. So I guess I can follow it up with a question like, how can we identify these Black spaces and then in turn celebrate and elevate them to our communities?
I think one way is recognizing that the designer lives in all of us. So part of it is, if you have, who are the friends, who's in your network, and asking them how they feel in spaces. I'm of the belief that like culturally conscious design exists everywhere, but it's about kind of tapping into the person who's in that space. This idea of like Black spaces or Latino spaces, Indigenous spaces. From my perspective, anywhere I am is a Black space. If I'm in there, it's a Black space, right? And so, but the question is it a space that is for me? Am I comfortable in that space? And that's taking it maybe a step further, because then it's giving me some agency, and it's giving me some ownership on how I would fashion the space. Now we appropriate spaces all the time. In my office, I've designed my office to be a particular way. The stage that you're on, you've designed it to be a particular way. How many of us have that agency in all of the spaces, or a majority of the spaces, or 50% of the spaces, or 10% of the spaces that we go into, right? So it's asking the not even a deep question, but just an intentional question. Does this space make you feel comfortable? So many of us kind of have to wash away our identity when we go into the public world. If I'm in a public park, or if I'm at the hospital, or if I'm at the grocery store, so many of those spaces are not fashioned for me. They're fashioned for mass. They're fashioned for a mass of white people, to be honest. And it's just about asking that one question. What would you do to change it? What would make you more comfortable here? Simple ways to just engage people in the conversation of creating space together. As I mentioned, it's got to be a collaborative process.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe as a follow-up to that, if I am, let's say, decorating my office, a public space, and I want it to feel as inclusive and make everyone feel comfortable, any advice for like me as a designer just trying to set up some furniture, things like that? Anything I can look at to try and make a space that makes everyone feel comfortable?
So that's a tricky question in my mind, because what I want to clearly identify here is that I'm talking about a space that reflects you. So if your office reflects you, then that's your space. If you're inviting people into that space, then ask those people what it would take for them to be comfortable. But in thinking about public spaces, when we're talking about buildings, when we're talking about infrastructure, so many of those spaces are not designed with us in mind at all. Quite literally, they're not even designed with women in mind, right? So you have a woman on stage with you. By the statistics of the design field in America, most of our spaces are designed by white men for the use of white men. And so it's kind of breaking away from that bias, breaking away from that shield, and recognizing that other people exist in the world. So for your private spaces, ask the question, I want you to come into my space. What would make you comfortable here? For our public spaces, it's about recognizing the power dynamics and understanding the power that we all play in space. And if you know that you have more power in a particular situation, how do you acquiesce some of it in order to give someone else more?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it actually made me think of a question I had earlier too, when you were talking about women and Black individuals in the architecture field, how few of them there are. What would you say, or what advice would you give to one of those minorities in that field that's just starting out?
Yeah. Well, one thing is, can you tell me your name?
My name is Chris.
Chris. So one thing I would say, Chris, just to begin is, it's little things like even the language. So in saying a minority architect, I don't say that, right? So removing that from the lexicon of how we think about individuals who practice in this field. Designers of color, people of color, Black architects, Latino urban planners. It's like, be specific with what you mean, what you're trying to say. And also the terminology. Being considered minor in the scope of the world, when in actuality, Black and brown people, people of color, are the majority across the entire globe. So all of these words are very important. The intentionality of how we look at what we do is very important. The other thing is how you kind of go through the education of it all. So I'm an urban planner by trade. I didn't learn any of this in my schooling. All of this came by way of me being in community, doing community development, working with neighbors, living overseas, having a lived experience. And then it also came by way of understanding that my lived experience should be validated in the classroom, in the studio, right? So all of these things are very difficult because, as I mentioned, 2% in the architecture field, 7% in the planning and design field. And so you think about how that reflects as well to the faculty and to the leadership of some of these programs. Well, if we're not learning culturally competent design practices in school, why is that happening? It's because we don't have faculty who are teaching that. The curriculum doesn't support that. And so it's also difficult for students of color who want to practice to see themselves in the field. And then when you get there, it's very expensive. There's also so many biases that play a role just in being in the program, right? If you're in studio, do you have everything that you need? Do you have all of the tools? Do you have money to pay for the printer? Do you have money to pay for the scanner, for the CDC router? All of these things that are required for you to go through the program with some level of success. So you've got the bias of faculty who may not know how to see your cultural experience as relevant. As I started in the beginning, it was about venerating one another's breath, right? Because if you can see me as a person, then you're going to acknowledge what I'm creating as a valid point of creation. But if you don't see that, if you see me as a minority, that's going to bias everything that I put in front of you. So it's small things like that that are actually grand in the scheme of it all.
Yeah, I think you partially answered. I was about to ask you a question, but I think you just partially answered it. But I was going to ask you, because there is so few people of color in the fields of architecture, what can we do to make that more accessible or generate interest in those fields? But like you just touched on, like, it gets very expensive to do these things, and that is part of the problem when it comes to accessibility. But I guess what are some changes do you think we can make to make it more accessible and to generate more interest in these fields when it comes to people of color?
Yeah, I absolutely love that question because it allows me to speak about some groups that I think are doing phenomenal work. So this idea of taking it away from the classroom and putting it into the community, that's the work that I love to do. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, everyone is a designer. Everyone is a designer. Whether or not you consider yourself an artist, whether or not you can only draw stick figures, you are a designer because you know what you like. You know what it takes to make yourself comfortable, right? And so the idea of citizen design is amazing to me. So doing workshops, having activations in these spaces that are non-traditional spaces. It's also about recognizing that maybe you don't have to go through the traditional field in order to be a designer. Why do I have to do that? And I understand that there's definitely requirements around fields of architecture and design and planning that you have to get licensed for, but there's also other ways to kind of bring people into that conversation and recognize that their lived experience is just as valid as your 4 years or 5 years of experience going through a studio program. There are amazing groups doing this right now. Design Justice League, phenomenal. Doing workshops in communities constantly. Black Space as an organization, again, phenomenal. Doing workshops in communities to let people know who live in these neighborhoods that they have agency. So it's opportunities like that where we can just be creative. We're designers, right? We are designers. Let's be creative in our thinking and find ways to abstract what we're doing if we want to bring more people into the conversation.
Gotcha. So I guess a follow-up to that, your presentation had, a lot of hope at the end of it, but do you, with all these organizations that are out there, making a difference, do you see the landscape of these fields changing within the next 5 to 10 years in a more positive direction, or do you think we still have a long way to go?
I think it's a both and situation. We have a long way to go just in terms of reconciliation in our country, which is why I think that the National Memorial for Peace and Justice is so transformative, because we're a country that's still struggling to acknowledge our history. So we have a long way to go as far as that's concerned. We have a long way to go in the practice of de-biasing. We have a long way to go in the practice of deconstructing inequity. But that being said, there's also phenomenal people who are just taking up the totem and running with it. DeMar Matthews is a young architect. I think he's 26 or 27 in LA doing these beautiful designs in community. So you have examples like this all over the place. We've got people here in Indianapolis who are doing this work as well. So I think it's a both and I hope that it at some point meets in the middle. It's not going to happen just from a top down. It's not going to happen just from a bottom up, but they have to keep moving in tandem together.
I do like the idea of sometimes it is difficult to change, like you're talking about with schooling, these large institutions to make any amount of significant change, but to have some amount of change coming from here in the classroom, maybe getting technical skills, learning a trade, and then also these community workshops, actually learning and feeling a space, and eventually having that come into a middle ground. I might have mixed up my analogies a little bit, but I love that parenthesing and how it'll eventually come closer. And it takes individuals to do that, individuals, and then big institutions, and to come into creating these spaces.
Yeah,
especially making smaller spaces where people feel comfortable. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. As I mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary practitioner because I couldn't get everything from one field. So it's planning, it's architecture, it's design, it's research, it's art, it's contemplation, it's meditation. All of these things feed into one another. And so, I think if like Le Corbusier said, that architecture could be a spectacle, he thought that because he was so enthralled by jazz. He was pulling inspiration from elsewhere. So we have to allow ourselves to do the same too. And I think we do that, but at some point we hit a wall when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion and equity and liberation. But it's no problem for us to design, a skyscraper that's got this magnificent edifice around it. So I think we just have to let ourselves dream, because we know that the impossible can be a reality.
That's awesome. We have a cue, actually, I think from behind the stage in production. Your talk touched on moments in our history, like the destruction of Greenwood and Tulsa. Most of us aren't taught moments like these. How does awareness of history play into what we make the future into what we want?
That's critical. It's critical. I mean, if we don't know what has come before, we're just going to repeat it. We have to learn our history. And learning your history is like learning a loved one, right? Like, it's like learning your spouse. It's like learning your child. It's like learning your parents. It's learning your best friend. You want to know them so that you can create experiences with them that are meaningful. It's the same thing with design. We have to know our history in order for us to do anything that's going to be significant for the future. And if what we don't know today is going to spill into negatively what we build tomorrow. We are actively making today tomorrow, right? Like that makes sense. What we know today doesn't show up until we learn it and apply it for tomorrow. So all of this is critical for us to know our history. It's absolutely critical for us to know our history. You know, with that said, I keep picking on Le Corbusier a little bit, but you know, he was this famous Swiss architect who really wanted to do something here in the States, and his design didn't get chosen, right? He wanted to do something called the Radiant City in Paris, and they didn't want it in Paris because they thought it was going to be detrimental on the social fabric of the people who lived there. And so the space was adopted by Robert Moses in 1935, 1945, something like that, in New York. And we know this area now as the Bed-Stuy Towers. When you think about the Bed-Stuy Towers, people automatically think of what I said earlier in my presentation. It's crime-ridden, it's divested, it's poor. But that happened because of the way Robert Moses picked out elements of Le Corbusier's plan instead of recognizing that it was meant to be a comprehensive plan for wellness. And so now this is the structure that we have that has built ghettos across the American city. So if we don't know that history, we're going to do that again and again and again. And guess what? America has done it again and again and again. So I love that question because our history is critical.
Absolutely. I love how you first tied it into getting to know a loved one. Like you still always love that person, but it's learning and making it better. Mm-hmm. And I want to say iterating, but it's not quite that. So I'm like kind of losing a word for it there, but I think that's immensely beautiful. And learning from the past is the only way to go forward. Mm-hmm. Especially the learning part. Learning underlined bold.
I think you talked about some groups and, you know, like all these creative things that are happening in other cities. Do you know of any resources or community programs or anything that designers can take advantage of locally? Like how can people in Indiana, how can designers in Indiana get started in the right direction?
Yeah, 100%. So I always suggest that people go through some kind of anti-racist training. Doesn't matter where you come from, what background you come from, go through anti-racist training, go through some kind of bias workshop. There's plenty of resources right here in Indianapolis. Spirit in Place does phenomenal workshops. Surge does phenomenal workshops. I also suggest going through some kind of design equity workshop. There's the People's Planning Academy that's opening up through the city, free. You just have to put in an application. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to learn about what are the restrictions for Indianapolis? What are the zoning laws for Indianapolis? How does our city function with policy and with people? The Black Space Organization, as I mentioned before, again, doing tours of communities, doing workshops so that we can partner our history with our practice. These are just 3 off the top that I always recommend people to go through. But in general, just do research and start with what you don't know. So ask yourself the hard question. What would make me more comfortable in this situation? And if if you are someone who has privilege and power and advantage, maybe take a pivot away from that and do something that would make you uncomfortable. If you're trying to learn something new, you know that it's a neighborhood that you're interested in. Learn about the history before you just go in and try and do a project, or you just go in and try to be the architect or the designer. Get to know the people. So I think those are some simple ways just to be engaged with organizations here in Indianapolis doing this work day in and day out.
I went through people. I signed up recently for the people of planning people. Shoot, now it's too many pieces. Yeah. They're a really great resource. It's a really long booklet of things that I haven't quite gotten through yet, but I'm excited to continue that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you signed up.
I'm super pumped. Cool.
Well, any other questions from you guys?
So we're gonna be in the Q&A.
I think that's
Like it.
yeah.
Again, such an amazing and powerful and inspiring talk, honestly. I think we're all very moved. Any final words you want to say before we wrap up?
I just want to say thank you, and I'm grateful, and I see you.
We definitely see you too. We're glad that you're able to it's so good. It's so good. Oh shoot, now I'm gonna forget. I'll ask you later off screen because I just blanked on the question. Where can people find more information about you? I know you're at Purdue. That's a pretty easy one to look up. But more information about the work that you're doing specifically.
Yeah, so I am working at Purdue Black Cultural Center. I also am an independent researcher here in Indianapolis. I have projects happening here in the Caribbean and New Orleans. I will share my information once more so you all can see that. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please, I don't know if you can all see my screen. I hope that you can, but there's my information there for you.
I think we'll be able to put it in the chat for you just after. I mean, we can't see the screen either, but I'm guessing it's you and us right now.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. We see you, and we're glad that we were able to allow others to also see you as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. We're going to take a 10-minute break, I think, and then we'll be back with the next speaker. Again, thank you so much.